Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. All right, let's talk about something that sounds technical on the surface, but is actually one of the most important questions in American politics right now. When a president pushes the limits of executive power and runs into Congress, who really wins, and what does that tell us about the health of the American system? Because this isn't just about one budget fight. It's not just about one administration, and it's definitely not just about one personality. What we're really watching is a stress test of the constitutional design itself. The framers of the Constitution were deeply suspicious of concentrated power. They had just fought a revolution against a king. So when they built the American system, they did something unusual for the time. They intentionally made it slow. They split power. They gave Congress the authority to write laws and, crucially, control the money. They gave the president the authority to execute those laws. And they gave the courts the authority to interpret disputes between the branches. That power of the purse in Congress wasn't an accident. It was the centerpiece. If you control the money, you control policy. The idea was simple. Even if a president wanted to go rogue, he couldn't fund his agenda without Congress. That was the structural safeguard. But here's where it gets interesting. Over the last few decades, the presidency has grown stronger, and not just symbolically. Administratively, financially, operationally, presidents now control massive bureaucracies, national security apparatuses, regulatory agencies, and emergency powers that the founders couldn't have imagined. And in moments of political gridlock, when Congress can't pass laws, can't agree on budgets, can't produce coherent policy, the incentive for the president to step in and just act becomes overwhelming. That's the context for the current conflict. When a president decides to freeze certain funds, redirect appropriations, reinterpret congressional intent, or aggressively use executive orders to reshape spending priorities, the argument from the White House is usually framed as efficiency. We were elected to act. The country needs movement. Congress is dysfunctional. We're executing the will of the people. And to be fair, there's some truth to that frustration. Congress has become deeply polarized. Budget battles turn into brinkmanship. Continuing resolutions replace real fiscal planning. Long-term strategic planning often gives way to short-term political theater. But here's the constitutional tension. Even if Congress is dysfunctional, it still holds the power of the purse. The Constitution doesn't say, if Congress is annoying, the president can bypass it. It says the legislature controls spending. So when a president tests that boundary by freezing funds that Congress has appropriated, by slow-walking implementation, or by creatively reinterpreting statutes, the legal question becomes unavoidable. Is this execution of the law, or is it rewriting the law? That's where the courts come in, and now the judiciary becomes the referee. But when the judiciary becomes the referee too often, something else happens. It becomes politicized. Every major policy fight ends up in court. Every executive action gets litigated. Every congressional challenge becomes a constitutional case. Over time, that shifts the balance again. Now the courts are no longer just interpreters of the Constitution. They become active participants in policy outcomes. And once that happens, public trust in the judiciary starts to erode because every decision is perceived through a partisan lens. So what looks like a simple budget dispute is actually a three-branch escalation cycle. Congress can't act decisively. The president acts unilaterally. The courts intervene, and the system becomes more adversarial, not less. But here's the deeper structural issue that often gets overlooked. Executive expansion isn't new. It didn't start yesterday. It didn't start with one administration. After 9/11, presidential war powers expanded dramatically. Emergency authorizations gave the executive branch enormous flexibility in national security. Surveillance programs expanded. Military operations continued under broad congressional authorizations that were rarely revisited. Then came the era of executive orders on immigration, healthcare implementation, regulatory reform, environmental policy. When Congress stalled, presidents increasingly used administrative rulemaking and executive directives to push agendas forward. Both parties did it because structurally it makes sense. If Congress is gridlocked and voters expect action, the presidency becomes the only branch capable of moving quickly. And voters reward action more than procedural restraint. That's the uncomfortable reality. The American public doesn't usually reward constitutional modesty, they reward visible results. They reward decisiveness. They reward leaders who get things done. But the constitutional design was never about speed. It was about friction. It was about forcing negotiation. It was about preventing concentration. So now we're in a paradox. The political culture demands speed. The constitutional structure demands restraint. The result is permanent tension. And here's where the budget fight becomes strategically significant, not just legally interesting. When presidents push the limits of spending authority, they're not just testing Congress. They're testing the long-term viability of legislative supremacy in fiscal matters. If Congress loses effective control over appropriations, in practice even if it retains it on paper, then the center of gravity shifts permanently toward the executive, and once that shift becomes normalized, it's very hard to reverse. You start to move, functionally, toward a system that resembles a semi-presidential model, even if formally it remains a constitutional republic with separation of powers. Now, let's zoom out even further. Why does this matter beyond constitutional theory? Because domestic institutional stability affects international credibility. When allies watch repeated shutdown threats, debt ceiling crises, budget freezes, and executive-legislative confrontations, they begin to question policy continuity. Can the United States maintain long-term commitments if its internal governance is so unstable? Strategic credibility isn't just about military strength, it's about predictability. If funding for foreign aid, defense commitments, or international agreements becomes subject to constant internal conflict, long-term partners hedge. They diversify, they reduce dependency. So what starts as a domestic constitutional fight has external consequences. There's another dimension here too, fiscal sustainability. If Congress and the president can't align on long-term budget discipline, deficits grow, debt expands, interest payments consume larger portions of federal revenue, and eventually, fiscal constraints limit strategic options. In that environment, executive action might look like leadership. But if it bypasses durable legislative consensus, it creates volatility rather than stability, and volatility over time weakens institutional authority. Let's be clear about something. Executive power expanding is not inherently authoritarian. In many cases, it's a rational response to legislative paralysis. But normalization is the danger. When emergency powers become routine tools, when executive orders substitute for legislation, when courts become constant referees, the equilibrium changes, and equilibrium is what the framers were trying to protect. There's also a psychological shift that happens in the electorate. When voters begin to see the presidency as the primary driver of all policy outcomes, expectations shift. Elections become high-stakes, winner-take all events. If the president controls everything, then losing the presidency feels catastrophic. That increases polarization. It increases emotional intensity. It raises the temperature of every cycle. In a balanced system, power is diffuse. Losses are limited. In a concentrated system, losses feel existential. That's not just theory. That's political psychology. So when we talk about a president freezing funds or clashing with Congress over appropriations, we're not talking about technical accounting maneuvers. We're talking about the trajectory of institutional power. Now, to be fair, Congress bears significant responsibility here. When lawmakers avoid making hard fiscal choices, when they rely on short-term continuing resolutions instead of comprehensive budgets, when partisan calculations override institutional authority, they weaken themselves. Power vacuums don't stay empty. If Congress doesn't assert its authority, the executive will fill the gap. And presidents, regardless of party, are incentivized to expand their reach. Once one administration pushes the boundary, the next administration inherits that expanded precedent. No one voluntarily gives power back. That's the ratchet effect of executive growth. So the question isn't whether this particular dispute will be resolved in court. It probably will be. The question is whether Congress as an institution can reassert durable control over fiscal direction. Because if the long-term pattern is executive initiative, followed by judicial arbitration, then the legislative branch slowly becomes reactive rather than proactive. And that changes the character of the republic. Some people argue that this is simply evolution, that the modern state requires a stronger executive, that global competition, rapid technological change, and security threats demand centralized decision-making. There's an argument there, but the counter-argument is equally strong. Concentrated power, even when efficient, erodes accountability and reduces deliberation. The American system was designed to slow things down on purpose. It was built on the assumption that ambition would counteract ambition, that institutional rivalry would protect liberty. If institutional rivalry turns into permanent dysfunction, however, the protective mechanism becomes destabilizing. That's the tightrope we're walking. We want friction, we don't want paralysis. We want efficiency, we don't want concentration. We want decisive leadership. We don't want unchecked authority. Balancing those impulses is incredibly difficult in a polarized era. And polarization is the accelerant in this entire dynamic. When compromise becomes politically dangerous, Congress becomes less capable of building coalitions. That strengthens the appeal of unilateral executive action. It's not that presidents wake up and decide to become more powerful. It's that the structural incentives push them in that direction. The media environment reinforces it too. Headlines reward bold action, not quiet negotiation. Social media amplifies dramatic gestures, not procedural nuance. So institutional restraint doesn't trend. But here's the long-term risk. If every administration pushes further than the last, the constitutional guardrails become norms rather than hard limits. And norms are fragile. Once broken repeatedly, they stop functioning. And at that point, restoring equilibrium becomes exponentially harder. So how should we think about this moment? Not as a crisis of one presidency, not as a partisan fight, but as a question of institutional resilience. Can Congress reclaim procedural discipline? Can the executive branch practice self-restraint? Can the courts maintain legitimacy while arbitrating increasingly political disputes? Those are systemic questions. If the answer is yes, the American system adapts and stabilizes. If the answer is no, power centralizes further. And history shows that centralized systems can be efficient in the short term but brittle in the long term. The genius of the American model wasn't speed. It was durability. Durability requires distributed authority. Distributed authority requires cooperation. Cooperation requires political incentives that reward compromise. Right now, those incentives are weak. So this budget and authority clash isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a signal about whether the balance of power is still a living principle or just a historical memory. The stakes are larger than one funding freeze. They're about whether legislative supremacy in fiscal matters remains operational or symbolic. And that's why this story matters. Because constitutional design isn't self-executing. It depends on behavior. It depends on restraint. It depends on branches defending their roles even when it's inconvenient. When that discipline fades, the structure tilts. And once tilted, gravity does the rest. So as we watch these conflicts play out, the real question isn't who wins this round. The real question is whether the American system can preserve its equilibrium in an era that constantly rewards imbalance. That's not a partisan issue. That's a structural one. And structural questions determine the trajectory of nations far more than any single policy fight ever could. Thanks for watching.